It is the night of October 13th, 54 ATD. Rome is alive with the sound of celebration. Torches blaze along the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. Laughter echoes through gilded halls, where senators, generals, and the most powerful men in the known world recline on silk cushions, raising cups of dark Falernian wine to their lips. The air is thick with incense, roasted meat, and the sweet rot of too many perfumed bodies pressed too close together in rooms built for spectacle and secrets. At the head of the longest table in the empire sits Claudius, the fourth emperor of Rome. He is 63 years old, limping, slightly hard of hearing, and, by most accounts, completely, catastrophically unaware that this is the last meal he will ever eat. But here is the thing that should stop you cold. No army is at the gate. No assassin lurks in the shadows with a blade. No barbarian horde is howling at the walls of the city. The most powerful empire the Western world has ever seen, 50 million people, 5 million square kilometers of conquered territory, legions that have marched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, is about to have its entire future rewritten. Not by a general, not by a revolution, not by the clash of iron and shields, by a mushroom. And the woman who arranged for that mushroom to be placed on that plate has been sitting beside her husband all evening, smiling, refilling his cup, the picture of Roman wifely devotion. Ask yourself this: what is more terrifying? The enemy you can see riding towards you across a battlefield, or the enemy who pours your wine, tucks your children into bed, and knows exactly which dose will kill you slowly enough to look like natural causes? Rome's greatest battles were never fought in the open. They were fought at dinner tables, in palace kitchens, in the small hours of the night when the torches burned low and the food tasters had already been dealt with. Tonight, we are going inside those battles. 3 women, 3 weapons you could hold in the palm of your hand. 3 moments that redirected the course of Western civilization. And you have never heard their stories told the way they deserve to be told. Livia, Agrippina, Locusta. Remember those names. If you have ever wondered how an empire of 50 million people could be steered by someone without a single soldier at their command, you are in exactly the right place. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever wondered whether the history books are telling us the whole truth. And if you are new here, this is what we do. We go where the official story ends, and we keep walking, like what you hear. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because what comes next is going to change the way you see Rome forever. This is the story of the silent killers of the Roman Empire, and how they rewrote history one death at a time. To understand what these women did, you first need to understand the world they lived inside, because nothing about Rome in the 1st century AD was what it appeared to be from the outside. From a distance, the Roman Empire looked like the most stable political structure humanity had ever constructed. It had roads that ran like arteries from Britain to Egypt. It had a professional army of some 300,000 soldiers, the finest fighting force in the ancient world. It had law courts, aqueducts, grain supplies, trade networks that stretched into India and China. It had everything, in other words, that a civilization needs to last forever. But it had one catastrophic flaw at the very center of everything. There was no law of succession. When an emperor died or was removed, there was no clear, codified, legally binding process for determining who came next. The Senate could theoretically choose. The Praetorian Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the emperor, often had the real say. Blood relatives mattered, but only if they were the right blood relatives. Adoption was common, so was murder. In this environment, the difference between wearing the purple and dying in a ditch was often not military skill, not political genius, not even popular support. It was access. It was information. It was the ability to be in the right room with the right people at exactly the right moment, and to have spent years quietly removing everyone who might complicate that moment. In this environment, poison was not just a weapon. It was a language. It was the language spoken by people who could not command legions. It was the language of those who had been legally, culturally, and socially excluded from every other avenue of power, and who had decided, with the cold clarity that desperation and brilliance produce in equal measure, that if they could not fight in the open, they would fight in the dark. Now, before we go any further, we need to pause and acknowledge something important. Almost everything we know about these three women comes from a handful of ancient historians. Tacitus wrote his Annals more than 60 years after some of the events he describes. Suetonius compiled his Lives of the Caesars decades after the fact, relying heavily on rumour, court gossip, and sources with political axes to grind. Cassius Dio wrote even later, and his text has come down to us in fragments recopied by Byzantine monks centuries after Rome itself had fallen. These men were brilliant. They were also products of a culture that was deeply, reflexively suspicious of powerful women, a culture in which the words for adulteress and poisoner were so frequently paired that they had almost become synonyms. So as we tell this story tonight, we hold two things in our hands at once: the accounts these historians left us, and the awareness that those accounts may tell us as much about Roman male anxiety as they do about these women's actual deeds. With that understood, let us meet them. The year is somewhere around 2 BC. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and the most powerful man alive, is tending his garden on the Palatine Hill. He does this himself, by hand, because he trusts what he grows with his own fingers. He has survived decades of civil war, conspiracy, and attempted assassination. He is not a naive man, but he is also a man who believes, in the privacy of his own garden, that he is safe. He is not looking at his wife. Livia Drusilla stands a few steps away, her expression serene, her posture impeccable. She is everything Rome has decided a Roman woman should be: composed, modest, devoted. She has worn the role for 30 years with such perfection that the empire itself has come to see her as its moral compass, its model matron, the living embodiment of the virtues carved onto the public monuments her husband commissions. She is also, according to Tacitus, watching those fig trees with the attention of someone who has a very specific reason for doing so. Here is what the ancient sources tell us. Augustus trusted figs. He picked them himself to avoid tampering. He believed correctly, one, that the best way to survive in a world full of enemies was to control what went into his body. And Livia, who had shared his bed for 5 decades and knew every habit he had, reportedly solved that problem with elegant simplicity, by going to the trees before he did. The fig that kills a man does not need to look different from the fig that does not. But here is where the story becomes complicated, and where the dread should begin to settle into your bones. Not because of what Livia may or may not have done to Augustus, but because of what she had already done quietly, methodically, over the course of many years to build the world she wanted. Augustus had no sons of his own. He had a daughter, Julia, from his first marriage. And through Julia he had grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, whom he adopted and named as his heirs. Was because that is what a man without biological sons did in Rome. He loved these boys. He cultivated them, educated them, prepared them to carry his legacy forward. Gaius died in 4 AD. He was 23 years old. His death followed a wound sustained in battle, but the wound was not, by most accounts, severe enough to be fatal. He wasted away over months in a way that his contemporaries found difficult to explain. Lucius had died 2 years earlier, in 2 AD, of a sudden illness while travelling. He was 22. 2 young, healthy, carefully prepared heirs, both dead within 2 years of each other. both dying at a moment in time when Livia's biological son, Tiberius, was the only viable candidate remaining. Tacitus does not accuse directly. He implies. He describes the timing as too convenient. He notes that Livia had access, motive, and, as a woman renowned for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, quite possibly the means. Modern historians are more cautious. Battle wounds did kill young men in the ancient world. Illness on the road was not uncommon. The circumstantial case is compelling. The evidentiary case is, by any rigorous standard, thin. But in Rome, among the elite who watched these deaths unfold, one thing was clear: Tiberius was emperor. And Livia had spent 40 years positioning him for exactly that outcome.
Not if I reach it.
Now move forward 50 years. The year is 49 AD. Agrippina the Younger, great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of the Emperor Caligula, niece and soon-to-be wife of the Emperor Claudius, is standing in a room where a decision is being made that will reshape the empire. She is 33 years old. She has already survived 2 exiles, the assassination of her brother, the political chaos of 3 successive emperors. She has a son named Lucius, a pale, watchful boy of 11, with his father's red hair and his mother's ice-cold calculation behind his eyes. History will come to know him as Nero. Agrippina does not wait. That is the one thing every ancient source agrees on. Where Livia played the long game across decades, Agrippina moves with the speed and precision of someone who has watched too many opportunities disappear while other people were still thinking about them. She has already, according to Suetonius, likely poisoned her second husband, Crispus, to inherit his wealth. The accusation cannot be proven, but Crispus died conveniently, and Agrippina arrived at his funeral solvent. Now she maneuvers, through flattery, through the strategic deployment of her imperial bloodline, through a marriage to her uncle that required the Roman Senate to pass special legislation because uncle-niece marriage was technically considered incest, to get her son, adopted by Claudius, as his heir. She arranges Nero's marriage to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, binding him to the Julio-Claudian house through blood on 2 sides. She places the philosopher Seneca as Nero's tutor, and the military commander Burrus at the head of the Praetorian Guard, building, piece by careful piece, a power base that exists entirely outside her own name. Tacitus writes that after Agrippina married Claudius, the country was transformed. Complete obedience, he says, was accorded to a woman. He does not mean this as a compliment. But here is the thing Tacitus cannot quite bring himself to say plainly. She was better at this than almost anyone else in Rome. She appeared on the obverse of imperial coins alongside Nero, a privilege no Roman woman had ever been accorded while still alive. She sat beside the emperor during diplomatic meetings. Generals and senators approached her as though she were a second ruler, because functionally she was, and then Claudius began to waver. By late 54 AD, ancient sources suggest that Claudius had grown dissatisfied. He was making noises about reconsidering the succession. He was spending more time with his biological son Britannicus, who was now approaching the age at which he could theoretically be named emperor in his own right. He was, in other words, becoming a problem, and Agrippina, who did not wait, started looking for solutions. Now meet the woman who made the solutions possible. The smell hits you first. Something sharp beneath the sweetness, an herbal bitterness that clings to the back of the throat like a warning. The room is small, stone-walled, lit by oil lamps that cast more shadow than light. On the workbench, jars of dark liquid, bundles of dried plants, small dead animals that served as test subjects, careful notations scratched onto wax tablets in a hand that belongs to someone who thinks in measurements. This is Locusta's world. She came from Gaul, modern-day France, though exactly how she arrived in Rome is unknown. It is possible she was captured as a slave during one of Julius Caesar's campaigns, which netted, by some estimates, close to 1 million people for the Roman slave markets. It is possible she came of her own volition, carrying her knowledge of plants and their properties like a merchant carries goods. What is certain is that by the time Agrippina found her, she was already notorious. She had already been imprisoned twice on poisoning charges. She had already, apparently, built a reputation among the wealthy and ambitious of Rome as someone who could get things done. She is described by historians as someone who tested her preparations on animals first, who adjusted concentrations based on results, who thought about timing, not just whether something killed, but when and how and what it looked like when it did. She could make a death look like illness. She could make a man hallucinate for days before he died. She could build something slow enough to fool the emperor's food taster and fast enough to prevent the victim from identifying what was happening to him. In any other civilization, at any other moment, this woman would have been a physician, a chemist, a pharmacologist whose knowledge of the natural world was, by the standards of her time, genuinely extraordinary. In Rome, in the 1st century AD, she was a weapon, and the most powerful people in the world were lining up to use her. Before we walk through what happened, we need to understand the battlefield, because this was a battlefield. It simply looked nothing like the ones the history books spend most of their time describing. The Palatine Hill was a complex of interconnected palaces, gardens, audience chambers, private dining rooms, kitchens, servants' quarters, storage rooms, Mayan corridors that wound through the whole structure like the passages of an enormous and very beautiful trap. It was a place where proximity to power was the only currency that mattered, and where that proximity could vanish overnight, with a word from the emperor, with a shift in factional favour, or less dramatically but far more permanently, with a cup of something that tasted exactly like everything else in the cup. The first line of defence for any emperor was the food taster. Every dish, every drink, every preparation that reached the imperial table was sampled first by a dedicated servant whose job was, in its essence, to die so that the emperor did not have to. This system worked. It worked reasonably well against fast-acting poisons, substances that announced themselves within minutes, so that caused the taster to collapse before the emperor had taken his first sip. But Locusta was not working with fast-acting poisons, not always. She understood the system she was working against, with the clarity of someone who had studied it from the inside. And she understood its fundamental weakness. A taster can only tell you what a poison does, not whether a poison is present. If the substance is slow enough, if it takes hours or days or years to produce its full effect, the taster eats, the taster feels fine, and the taster nods. The emperor eats. The emperor feels fine for a while. She also understood, and this is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, that the delivery mechanism matters as much as the substance itself. It is not enough to have a poison. So you need a way to introduce it that the entire protective apparatus around the target cannot anticipate. And the most elegant solutions to that problem are the ones that use the protective apparatus against itself. Now let us talk about the weapons. Atrippa belladonna, deadly nightshade, was one of the most commonly used poisons in the Roman world. Its fruits contain alkaloids that, in small doses, cause hallucinations, disorientation, and an accelerated heartbeat. In larger doses, they shut down the nervous system and stop the heart. The dose that kills is not dramatically larger than the dose that merely incapacitates, which makes it useful for a poisoner who wants to disguise a murder as a sudden illness following a period of strange behaviour. Locusta reportedly advised Agrippina to use it in the preparation for Claudius's death. Previous Empress Livia was said to have used similar compounds against her contemporaries. Aconite, wolfsbane, was faster and more reliable, but harder to disguise. It produced a distinctive numbness and tingling in the extremities before shutting down cardiovascular function. Roman physicians knew what it looked like, which meant it carried risk. Hemlock was the poison of philosophers. slow, progressive, beginning at the feet and working upward, buying the victim hours in which they remained mentally clear while their body stopped responding. It was the kind of death that looked to the uninformed observer like a wasting illness, which is precisely why it was useful for the long game approach that seems to have characterized whatever Livia may or may not have done to Augustus's adopted heirs. There were also compounds for which we have no modern identification, substances described in ancient sources that produced specific effects without leaving traces that contemporary physicians could recognize. We know they existed because the historians described their effects. We do not know exactly what they were, which is itself a reminder that the gap between what Rome knew and what we assume they knew is considerably larger than most people imagine. And then there were the delivery mechanisms. Mushrooms were Claudius's weakness. He loved them unreservedly, not a sophisticated love, but the straightforward enthusiasm of a man who had found something that gave him uncomplicated pleasure in a life that had not offered much of it. This was known. Everyone who spent time near the imperial table knew it. And it meant that a dish of mushrooms arriving at the emperor's place would be consumed with the appetite of genuine desire rather than the caution of an experienced survivor. The feather was Locusta's masterstroke. Or rather, and this is the detail that separates a competent poisoner from a genuinely brilliant one, the feather was not the primary delivery mechanism. It was the contingency. Claudius, being not entirely stupid, had a habit of carrying a feather with him during meals, so that if he suspected he had consumed something harmful, he could use it to induce vomiting before the substance reached his bloodstream fully. This was his safety net, and Locusta knew about it. And so the feather was soaked in something that made it not a safety net but a second dose, so that the act of trying to save himself completed the task that the mushroom had begun. The cold water in Britannicus's goblet was something else entirely. Something that required a detailed understanding not just of poison but of court ritual, of the specific customs around how wine was served at imperial banquets, of the precise point in the service where a substance could be introduced without being observed. Hot wine was tasted, cold water was not. Nobody tasted the water used to cool the wine. The system had a blind spot, and Locusta had found it. Now, let us understand the strategy of each woman, because while all three operated in the same dark space, they operated there very differently. Livia's strategy was patience so extreme, it bordered on the geological. She did not move quickly. She did not need to. She was married to the most powerful man alive. She had access to the innermost workings of the imperial household. And she had time, decades of it, to position pieces on a board that most people did not even know was a board. If she removed obstacles, she removed them at intervals long enough that no single death could be connected to any other. If she poisoned the figs, she chose a method that was entirely deniable. Augustus himself would select the fruit, would believe he was eating something safe, and would die without understanding what had happened. The perfect Livia operation left no moment at which any investigator could point and say, "Here, this is where it was done." Yet Agrippina's strategy was the opposite of patience. She was working against a clock, specifically the clock of Claudius's changing mind, and she knew it. When she moved with the coordination of a general executing a prepared plan, deploying multiple assets simultaneously, the poison to incapacitate, the physician to ensure death, the food taster to be managed, the hours after death to be controlled. Where Livia played across decades, Agrippina compressed her operation into a single night and then spent the hours that followed making certain that the world's understanding of what had happened aligned precisely with what she needed it to understand. Locusta's strategy was science. She worked the way a scientist works, with hypotheses, with testing, with adjustment based on results, but with the willingness to try again when the first attempt is insufficient. When Nero told her that the initial poison prepared for Britannicus was too slow, when he flogged her with his own hand and threatened her with execution if she failed again, she did not panic. She tested, she adjusted, she found the cold water. Now, it is late. The palace is quieter than it was 2 hours ago. Most of the servants have been dismissed. The torches in the outer corridors are burning low. Somewhere in a stone room that no map of the Palatine has ever marked, a woman is alone with her work. Locusta is not young anymore. She has been imprisoned and released, and imprisoned again. She has watched the most powerful people in the world treat her expertise as a commodity to be purchased and discarded. She has tested her preparations on animals that did not know they were test subjects, and she has written down the results with the precision of someone who cares about accuracy above everything else. Does she know what she's doing? Of course she knows. Does she feel anything about it? The ancient sources do not tell us. Tacitus does not give her interior life. Suetonius does not describe her expressions. She has no voice in the historical record. Only the effects of her work, and the reactions of the powerful people who employed her. She exists in history as a function, as the means by which certain people died and certain other people came to power. But she was a person. She had come from somewhere. She had learned something extraordinary about the natural world, about the line between healing and harm, words about the way that plants and compounds and doses interact with living bodies. And she sat in that stone room, in that torchlight, and she made the preparations that would, by the following evening, have changed everything. Not far away, Agrippina is awake too. She is looking at her son. Nero is 16 years old and sleeping with the abandon of someone who does not yet fully understand what his mother has arranged for him. He has his father's hair. He has his mother's cheekbones. He is not, by any measure, a child. Roman boys of 16 were already men in the eyes of the law, already capable of military service, already capable of governing provinces if their bloodlines demanded it. But in the torchlight, asleep, he looks younger. Agrippina has sacrificed 3 husbands, one to death, one to strategic disposal, one to murder, to get this boy to this moment. She has spent 20 years learning the internal geography of imperial power, the names and weaknesses of every functionary who controls access to the emperor, the schedule of every taster and guard and physician in the Palatine complex. She has built alliances, called in debts, arranged marriages, passed legislation. She has made herself indispensable to a man she despised and endured the contempt of a court that could not decide whether to fear or ridicule her. All of it for this. Tomorrow night, her husband will eat, and Nero will be emperor. She does not wake him. She turns and walks back to her rooms in the dark, and the torchlight catches the line of her jaw for just a moment. Set, certain, and absolutely without doubt. In another part of Rome, a young servant who has no name in any historical record is preparing to go to work at the imperial palace. He will stand near the emperor's table. He will taste what he is given to taste. He will nod and smile and think about whatever servants think about during long formal dinners. Home, perhaps, or the girl he is going to see when his shift is done. He will feel fine all evening because the thing he needed to taste is not in the dish he tasted. He will never know how close he stood to the hinge of history. The senses reach a palace before the mind does. Sound arrives first, the low, continuous murmur of voices from 100 different conversations happening simultaneously in a space designed to carry sound, to amplify it, to make the powerful feel more powerful by reflecting their words back at them from gilded ceilings. Below the conversation, music, flutes and lyres, the kind of music that is technically beautiful and functionally invisible, the auditory equivalent of the servants' white tunics, present, pleasant, and designed to be forgotten. Then smell. Roasted game, bread still warm, the sulphurous edge of the lamps, and underneath all of it, the particular sweetness of Falernian wine, Rome's finest, served at every imperial occasion, regardless of whether anyone actually liked it, because that was what imperial occasions demanded. Then sight, a room that would strike a modern observer as almost unbearably beautiful. Marble floors laid in geometric patterns of red and white and black. Frescoed walls depicting gods and heroes in poses of eternal triumph. Couches of dark wood, inlaid with ivory, where the guests recline in the Roman fashion. She never quite sitting, always half horizontal, a posture that manages to communicate both relaxation and the specific kind of readiness that people who have survived in a dangerous court develop over time. And at the centre of all of it, the table, the food, the cups. This is where empires are actually made and broken. Not on the battlefield, here. One more thing before it begins. Silence. For just a fraction of a second, between one breath and the next, between one note of the flute and the following one, the room seems to hold itself very still. It is the kind of stillness that happens when something important is about to occur, and the universe, which does not actually pay attention to human drama, but seems to, in moments like this, pauses. Then the moment passes. The music continues, the wine is poured, and history steps forward. He was not a stupid man. This is important to understand because Rome's subsequent historians spent considerable effort making Claudius look like a fool, limping, stammering, absorbed in scholarly interests that the military aristocracy considered unworthy of an emperor, manipulated by his freedmen, deceived by his wives. There is enough truth in parts of this picture to make the caricature stick, but the man who survived Caligula's reign of terror by making himself appear harmless, who wrote multi-volume histories of Rome and Carthage and Etruria in multiple languages, who reformed the imperial bureaucracy and extended Roman citizenship across the empire. That man was not a fool. He was a survivor. And survivors are careful. He loved mushrooms. He trusted his food taster. He carried a feather. He was, in other words, as defended as a man in his position could reasonably make himself. And none of it was enough. Because the people who had decided he needed to die had thought about his defences longer and harder than he had. The dinner begins normally. There is no record of when exactly the dish is placed before him. The ancient sources are frustratingly imprecise about the timeline of a man's last meal. What we know is that mushrooms are present. What we know is that the food taster does his job, and the food taster does not die, and the food taster nods with the confidence of a man who has eaten a little of this thing and felt fine. What we know is that Claudius, who loves mushrooms, without complication, eats, but the effect is not immediate. It is not supposed to be. The poison Locusta prepared was not designed for speed. It was designed for delay, for the careful production of symptoms that looked in their early stages like the ordinary discomfort of a man who has overeaten or drunk too much, or perhaps is simply tired after a long evening of imperial obligation. The stomach cramps begin, the face flushes. The emperor, who has had evenings like this before, is not particularly alarmed, but the symptoms deepen. At some point, the sources disagree about when, Claudius realizes something is wrong. He reaches for the feather. He intends to do what he always does when he suspects contamination: introduce the feather into his throat, induce vomiting, expel whatever is troubling him before it goes further. It is a reasonable precaution. It has worked before, but this feather is not the same feather he began the evening with. We do not know when it was switched. We do not know who switched it. We know only that the feather that Claudius uses to try to save himself is the same feather that finishes him, soaked, according to several ancient sources, in a substance that ensures what the mushroom began cannot be reversed. He retches. He does not feel better. He retches again. The cramps intensify. The people closest to him, the servants, the attendants, the members of his household who have spent their professional lives at close range to imperial mortality, begin to understand that this is not an ordinary indisposition. The physician is called. His name is Xenophon. He is a respected member of the imperial household, a man who has attended the emperor through genuine illnesses and come to know his physiology with professional intimacy. He enters the room. He examines the emperor. He produces a long feather, the kind used, he says, to assist the patient in clearing his throat and airway. Tacitus tells us what happens next, with a brevity that hits harder than any elaborate description could. Xenophon, he writes, smeared the feather with a fast-acting poison and introduced it into the emperor's throat under the pretense of medical assistance. The door closes. Claudius's sounds cease. Outside the room, Agrippina stands in the corridor. Her face is composed. When a servant approaches with a question, she answers with the calm certainty of someone who has already moved past this moment in her mind. The emperor is resting. The emperor should not be disturbed. She needs a little more time. She needs the time because in another part of the palace the transfer of power is already in motion. Nero, 16 years old, rehearsed, surrounded by the people his mother has spent years positioning around him, is waiting. Burrus, the Praetorian commander Agrippina has installed for exactly this purpose, is waiting. The legions outside the city, whose loyalty has been quietly cultivated through Agrippina's network of relationships, are waiting. For hours, the sources suggest, somewhere between 4 and 12, the Emperor of Rome is dead, and the world does not know it. Agrippina manages the information the way a general manages the flow of troops. Nothing leaves the palace that she has not authorized. Claudius's death is concealed behind the fiction of a resting, ailing emperor, while the architecture of his succession is secured piece by piece in real time. And then Nero steps out into the light. He is greeted by Burrus and the Praetorian Guard, who, having been prepared, having been cultivated, having been, in several key cases, newly appointed by Agrippina herself, acclaim him emperor on the spot. The Senate ratifies the accession with the speed of people who have already decided they prefer the certainty of a named successor to the chaos of an open contest. The legions in the provinces receive word and stand down. The transition is, by the standards of Roman imperial succession, almost miraculously smooth. It is smooth because it was planned. Every single element of it was planned, and the planning began the moment Agrippina understood that her window was narrowing. Claudius is cremated 10 days later. His ashes go into the mausoleum of Augustus. The Senate, prompted by Agrippina, votes to deify him, to make the man she murdered into a god. Nero makes a public speech praising his adoptive father's wisdom and greatness. It is written by Seneca. It is delivered with the accomplished sincerity of a 16-year-old who has been trained since childhood for exactly this performance. Rome applauds. Rome moves on. The mushrooms were particularly good that evening. Nero reportedly called them afterward the food of the gods. A joke that landed in the court with the particular kind of nervous laughter that accompanies a punchline everyone understands and nobody dares to explain. 4 months. That is how long it takes before Nero decides that the death of his adoptive father is not enough. Britannicus is 13 years old. He is the biological son of Claudius, the boy who should, in any straightforward line of succession, be sitting on the throne that Nero is occupying. He is not a serious political threat in any immediate practical sense. Too young, too isolated, his network of supporters systematically dismantled by Agrippina over the preceding years. But he exists. And Nero, who is beginning to discover that power feels different from the inside than it looked from the outside, has concluded that a person who has any claim to what he has cannot be allowed to keep existing indefinitely. Agrippina, ironically, is now a complication rather than an asset. She has begun making noises about Britannicus as a counterweight to Nero's growing independence, not because she genuinely prefers Britannicus, but because Nero has started doing things without consulting her, which is the one thing she cannot tolerate. And so, the mother who spent 20 years constructing the path to the throne for her son now finds herself inadvertently providing her son with a reason to demonstrate that he does not need her. Nero calls for Locusta. The challenge this time is different from the Claudius operation. Claudius was elderly and somewhat unwell, which meant a death that took hours and produced symptoms resembling those of natural illness was entirely plausible. Britannicus is 13 years old and healthy, which means a death that takes hours will generate questions that cannot be managed as easily. But a death that happens too fast carries its own risks. It is too obviously deliberate, too impossible to attribute to the vicissitudes of a delicate constitution. And there is the food taster problem in its most acute form. The customs around serving wine at an imperial banquet are specific and known. Hot wine is poured from a jug, tasted by a designated servant, confirmed safe, and then brought to the guest who wants it cooler. And many guests want it cooler because the Romans often served wine warm and young drinkers often preferred something less aggressive. Calls for cold water to be added from a separate vessel. And that vessel is not tasted. Because why would you taste the water? The wine was already tasted. The wine was safe? Why would anyone put something in the water? Because Locusta saw the gap that no one else was looking at. The evening begins. Britannicus is at table with Nero and the rest of the imperial household. He is close enough to Nero that they are eating from the same general service, an intimacy of proximity that reads as affection to any outside observer and means, practically, that Britannicus's food and drink come through the same channels as everyone else's, which are channels that have been tested and confirmed. A cup of hot wine is brought to Britannicus. The food taster, young, thorough, professionally paranoid, lifts it and drinks from it. He waits. He feels fine. He hands it to Britannicus with the nod that means, "This is safe." Britannicus takes the wine. It is too hot. He calls for cold water to lower the temperature. A servant, whose role in this moment has been arranged in advance in ways that Britannicus could not possibly know, brings the water carafe and pours. The water is cold. The wine cools to a drinkable temperature. Britannicus lifts the cup to his lips. He drinks. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then. And here is the moment that every ancient source describes with the same blunt shock, as if the writers are still processing what they witnessed even decades later. Britannicus convulses. His body goes rigid. His hands lose the cup. His face drains of all colour in an instant, the way a face drains when the body's systems receive an instruction they cannot process, and everything shuts down at once. He falls. He does not speak. He cannot speak. He is, by every practical measure, already dying before he hits the floor. The room is absolutely still. Then Nero speaks. His voice is calm. His expression is calibrated to the precise frequency of mild concern, combined with the weary familiarity of someone who has seen this before. He looks at the assembled senators and courtiers and family members who are staring at the body of a 13-year-old boy, and he says, with the conviction of someone who has rehearsed this sentence, his brother suffers from these episodes. It is a condition he has had since childhood. There is no cause for alarm. The physicians will attend to him. Please, continue the evening. The flutes begin again. Somewhere wine is poured. Conversation restarts with the awkward, halting quality of people who have just been witnesses to something they do not have the social language to acknowledge. Agrippina says nothing. She sits at her place at the table, and she says absolutely nothing. And the ancient sources, particularly Tacitus, pause on this detail with the particular attention of writers who understand that the most revealing moments are often the ones in which nothing happens. Because Agrippina, who arranged the death of Claudius and built the road to the throne, has just understood something that no amount of planning has prepared her for. Her son has done this without her. Not just without her approval, without her involvement, without consulting her, without using her network, without needing anything from her except the infrastructure she spent decades building, which he has now inherited and is perfectly capable of operating on his own. She is looking at a 13-year-old boy who is dying on the marble floor of a palace she helped design, and she's thinking, the ancient sources do not tell us this. But the logic of the situation is inescapable. She is thinking that the boy on the floor and the woman at the table are not as different as she had assumed. Britannicus dies that night. His body, according to Suetonius, is buried immediately, with a speed that Tacitus notes was unusual, and that Nero explained as a wish to avoid an extravagant public display of grief. The rain, Tacitus adds, fell on his funeral, as if even the weather understood that something had ended and was marking the occasion in the only language it knew. Now go back. Go further back than Claudius and Britannicus and Nero. Go back to the Rome of Augustus, the Rome of the early empire, the Rome that still believed, or was still being told to believe, that the transition from republic to empire had been accomplished cleanly and constitutionally, so that the man who called himself the first citizen rather than the king was simply a dedicated public servant rather than the most powerful autocrat the Western world had ever produced. In that Rome, Livia moves like weather, felt everywhere, visible nowhere, her effects obvious only in retrospect. Gaius Caesar is 23 years old. He is Augustus's adopted son and designated heir. He has commanded Roman forces in the east with sufficient distinction that his grandfather considers his succession essentially settled. In 1 AD, he sustains a wound during operations near the Euphrates. It is not a mortal wound. Contemporary military physicians assess it as manageable, and Gaius himself initially believes he will recover. But he does not recover. Over the following months, he declines steadily, losing first his energy and then his appetite, and then his ability to maintain the basic functions that keep a young, healthy man alive. He dies in 4 AD. He is 23. Lucius Caesar died 2 years before him. He was 22. The cause? A sudden illness, onset while he was travelling, progression so rapid that he was dead before Augustus received reliable news of his sickness. Now, here is the thing about these two deaths that Tacitus finds impossible to dismiss, and modern historians find impossible to prove. They follow a pattern, not a medical pattern, a strategic pattern. Every death, Lucius, then Gaius, then later Agrippa Posthumus, Augustus's last surviving grandson, who is murdered the morning after Augustus dies. Every single death removes precisely the obstacle that is next in line between Livia and her goal. The deaths are spaced, they are distinct, they are individually explicable, but in sequence they describe a specific trajectory, arriving at a specific destination, Tiberius on the throne. We cannot know, that is the honest position. We cannot know whether Livia arranged these deaths, or whether she simply watched them happen with the private satisfaction of someone whose plans were being fulfilled by coincidence, or whether the coincidence was total, and Tacitus has constructed a conspiracy from the ordinary terrible mortality of the ancient world. The gap between circumstance and evidence is an honest one, and we should not pretend it is smaller than it is. But we can know this. Livia was in the room. She was always in the room. She had access to food, to drink. She's to the physicians and servants and household officials of every significant person in Augustus's succession line. She had knowledge of herbs, of remedies, of the chemistry of plants in a world where the line between medicine and poison was drawn by intention rather than substance. And she had the patience, the extraordinary decades-long, almost geological patience, of someone who understood that the most powerful force in politics is not the dramatic move, but the one that is never recognized as a move at all. Augustus dies on August 19th, 14 AD. He is 77 years old. He has been ill for some time. His death in isolation is not suspicious. Suetonius records the story of the figs. Cassius Dio records the story of the figs. The story says that Livia, for knowing Augustus would only eat figs he had picked himself from his own garden, went to the trees before him and applied a substance to the fruit while it was still on the branch, so that the one precaution Augustus had developed against being poisoned became the mechanism of his poisoning. He ate the fruit of his own careful habit, and it killed him. Modern historians almost unanimously doubt this particular story. Augustus was 77 and unwell. He did not need to be poisoned to die. The fig story has the quality of legend, too neat, too perfectly ironic, too precisely calibrated to the known facts of his routines. It sounds like something a storyteller would invent to tie the threads together. But Livia heard it. She knew people were saying it, and she gave no sign that it troubled her. Tiberius became emperor, and he did not like his mother. He found her overbearing, controlling, insufferable. He spent much of his reign as emperor trying to limit the power she had built for herself, while he occupied the throne she had built for him. He refused to allow the Senate to name her Mother of the Nation. He overruled the honours voted to her with consistent and petty regularity. He did not attend her funeral, and yet he was emperor, and she had made him emperor. And whatever she had done or not done in the decades between their marriage into the Julio-Claudian line and Tiberius's accession, the result was exactly what she had worked toward. A result that served her vision of what Rome should look like more completely than almost any military victory in the empire's history. After the death of Britannicus, Locusta does not disappear, she flourishes. Nero names her his official poisoner. This is not a metaphor or an informal understanding. It is a position with a title, with compensation, with the specific practical benefit of imperial protection against the legal consequences of her profession. She receives large country estates. She receives servants. She receives, most usefully, a steady stream of students, young men sent by Nero to study the art of poison under her instruction, to learn the vocabulary of plants and compounds and doses that she has spent her life compiling. She runs what you might, without much exaggeration, call a school. The darkest school in Rome, a school whose curriculum consisted entirely of applied chemistry in the service of power, whose students graduated with the ability to make people die in ways that looked like they had not been killed. And Nero, who is by now well into the phase of his reign in which the word stable has ceased to apply, keeps a reserve of Locusta's fastest working preparation in a small golden box. He carries it with him. It is his final insurance, his backup against the possibility of capture, the guarantee that if the worst should happen, he will not have to endure whatever his enemies might do to him before they kill him. He uses this box, this little golden container of Locusta's expertise, as a statement, as a reminder to himself and to anyone who sees it that he is never more than a moment's decision from the most irrevocable kind of exit. But when the end finally comes for Nero, which in 68 AD, when the Senate declares him an enemy of the state and the Praetorian Guard, withdraws its support, and he finds himself in a villa on the outskirts of Rome with nowhere left to run, he cannot use the box. The sources do not agree on why. Some say he had given it away. Some say it was lost in the chaos of his flight. Some say he could not bring himself to use it even now, that the man who had so casually ordered the deaths of his brother, his mother, his first wife, and an unknowable number of others, could not in the end apply that same casualness to himself. He dies with the help of a secretary, stabbing himself awkwardly in the throat and reportedly lamenting that such an artist was dying in such a graceless way. The golden box and whatever it contained vanishes from the historical record. Locusta does not vanish. Not immediately. She is still alive when Nero dies, and the new Emperor Galba, who has, to put it mildly, a different philosophy of governance, recognizes her immediately for what she is. Not just a dangerous person, but a symbol, an embodiment of everything that made Nero's reign a byword for excess and horror. She is arrested. She is not simply executed in some private room where her death can be neat and deniable. She is chained. She is walked through the streets of Rome in those chains, in front of crowds who know exactly who she is and what she has done. She is displayed, a lesson, an advertisement, a statement about what the new regime considers unacceptable, and about how certain debts to history are settled in public. And then she is killed. The specific method is disputed. Cassius Dio says she was executed. Then a later legend, one that scholars consider almost certainly apocryphal, says she was killed in the Circus Maximus by a trained giraffe in a manner too grotesque to describe in detail. The Romans did have a taste for elaborate animal punishments, and the legend has the quality of dark invention that accumulates around a famous name after death. What we can say with confidence is that she died in 69 AD, in the first year of Galba's reign, having spent the intervening years after Nero's death in the same chains that most of Nero's associates found themselves wearing. She left no written record. She named no heirs. The school she ran dissolved. The students scattered. But the knowledge she possessed, the accumulated chemistry of decades, through the understanding of plants and doses and timing and delivery, that knowledge did not disappear with her. You cannot uncreate understanding once it has been applied. The people she taught went somewhere. The techniques she developed were written into the general body of Roman pharmacological knowledge, where they sit alongside the remedies and the treatments and the long list of things that human beings have discovered that can be done to other human beings with the right combination of plants and the right understanding of the body. The silence is absolute now. The palace is empty of the people who filled it. Count the dead. Not the dead on a battlefield, where the numbers come in thousands and the individuals disappear into aggregate statistics. Count these dead, one at a time, because each one of them represents a turning point that sent history down a road it would not otherwise have travelled. Gaius Caesar, 23 years old, dead in 4 AD. Lucius Caesar, 22 years old, dead in 2 AD. Claudius, 63 years old, dead on the night of October 13th, 54 AD. His body, according to the records of his cremation, showed signs of prolonged distress, consistent with what modern toxicologists, when asked to assess the ancient accounts, identify as symptoms of belladonna alkaloid poisoning combined with a secondary rapid-acting agent. He was identified at his cremation by members of his household who had attended him for decades. He was deified by the Senate within weeks. His name was added to the list of divine emperors by the same government that had watched him die, Britannicus, 13 years old. Dead in February 55 AD. He was identified on the floor of the banquet hall by the imperial physicians who attended him. His death was so fast that there was no medical record of any symptoms beyond the convulsive episode, a fact that, in retrospect, points to a compound designed for exactly that quality of speed. He was buried that night, in the rain, without ceremony. He has no known tomb. He was 13 years old, Agrippa Posthumus, 26 years old, murdered on the morning after Augustus died, before his grandfather's death was publicly announced. He was killed by soldiers acting on orders whose source remains, 2,000 years later, genuinely disputed. Augustus himself may have ordered it in advance, or Livia may have, or Tiberius. All three had motive. None left a confession. Augustus, 77 years old, was dead on August 19th, 14 AD. in the city of Nola. His death was not publicly questioned in his lifetime. He was old, he was ill, he had been declining for years. The fig story circulated afterward, carried by the current of gossip and political animosity that surrounded his succession. It has never been proven. It has never been conclusively disproven. Now zoom out. Stand at the edge of the Palatine Hill, at any point between 54 and 68 AD, and look down at the city that spread out below it in every direction. The Forum, the temples, the markets, the apartment blocks stacked 7 stories high in neighbourhoods where 250,000 people lived in space, designed for 1/10 that number. The Circus Maximus, where chariot races drew crowds that would fill a modern NFL stadium twice over. To the aqueducts carrying fresh water from the mountains, the roads along which the empire's commerce and armies moved with a regularity that would not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. All of it, in this moment, belongs to Nero. Nero, who is 17 years old and emperor because a dish of mushrooms was placed on the right table on the right evening, and a feather was switched at the right moment, and a physician who had sworn to heal decided it was more advantageous to harm. The city does not know this. The city goes about its business with the efficiency of a system so large that its daily operations require very little input from whoever sits on the throne. Bread is distributed. Courts convene. Legions march to their postings on the Rhine and the Euphrates and the wall in Britain. But the direction of all of it, the vector, the destination, has changed. Because the person sitting on the throne is not Britannicus. And it is not, as Augustus originally intended, Gaius or Lucius. And the person who ensured that these substitutions occurred is a woman whose name will not appear on any official document of the Roman state, who held no title that any law recognized, who commanded no soldiers and voted in no assembly, Agrippina the Younger. And behind her, Livia. And in their service, for the moments when what was needed could not be obtained through politics alone, Locusta. The battlefield is empty now, in the way that all battlefields eventually become empty, stripped of the urgency that made every detail matter, reduced to stone and marble, and the records that surviving parties chose to preserve. The dining rooms of the Palatine still exist in archaeological remnant. The bones of the hill are still there, layered over each other across the centuries, like pages of a book written in a language that only the ruins can read. The cups have been carried away. The feathers have rotted. The small stone jars that once held compounds for which we no longer have names have been lost to the earth. What remains is the shape of what happened. The outline of a strategy. The shadow of 3 women who understood, with absolute clarity, that power is not exclusively the thing that wears the crown. Sometimes power is the thing that decides which head the crown goes on. Here is the question that has been sitting underneath everything we have discussed tonight. For the question that the ancient sources cannot quite bring themselves to ask directly, because to ask it directly would be to admit something uncomfortable about the civilization they are describing. What happens to an empire whose fundamental mechanism of succession is violence? Not the open violence of a coup or a civil war. Those, at least, have the virtue of clarity. The violence of declaration and counter-declaration, of armies that choose sides and battles that resolve the question publicly. That kind of violence is legible. It produces winners and losers that everyone can identify. It ends. But this kind of violence, the quiet kind, the kind that hides behind a dish of food or a vessel of water or a fig still warm from the tree, this kind does not end. It cannot end because it cannot be acknowledged. Every death must be explained away. Every transition must be presented as natural, as inevitable, as the will of the gods, rather than the will of a woman with a small jar and a long memory. And in a system where nothing can be acknowledged, nothing can be fixed. Tiberius sat on the throne that Livia built for him, and spent his reign in a state of barely concealed paranoia, retreating finally to the island of Capri, where he lived out the last decade of his rule in isolation, conducting the business of empire through intermediaries, and leaving Rome to the tender management of a praetorian prefect named Sejanus, who turned out to be staging a slow-motion coup that Tiberius eventually recognized and crushed, in the way that such things are crushed in Rome, with a series of executions. Caligula followed Tiberius. Claudius followed Caligula. Nero followed Claudius. Each transition was smoother than the last in some ways, and more violently destabilized the dynasty in others, until with Nero, the Julio-Claudian line finally exhausted itself in the year of 4 emperors, a 12-month period in 69 AD, during which 4 different men held the imperial title, 3 of them dying in the process. And Rome came closer to genuine dissolution than it had at any point since Augustus ended the civil wars. The dynasty that Livia built across 60 years of patient, ruthless, brilliant positioning lasted precisely as long as the violence that sustained it could be managed. And then it collapsed in exactly the way that systems built on unacknowledgeable violence always collapse. Suddenly, completely, and with a chaos that bore no relationship to the apparent stability that preceded it. If Claudius had lived, if Britannicus had taken the throne at 15 or 16 instead of Nero, the course of Roman and therefore Western history diverts at a junction that is genuinely impossible to map with any confidence. Nero's reign produced the first systematic persecution of Christians in Rome, the Great Fire of 64 AD, whose cause remains disputed, but whose connection to Nero's administration does not. The suicide of Seneca, the death of the poet Lucan, and the progressive militarization of the empire's political culture that would eventually transform the Principate into something that even Augustus's most cynical architects would not have recognized. None of these outcomes were inevitable. All of them flowed through chains of cause and effect that historians have traced with varying degrees of certainty, from a single autumn evening and a dish of mushrooms. And history, the official history, the history written by men with access to the imperial archives and the cultural authority to determine what was preserved and what was lost, recorded this as the natural death of an elderly emperor. Because that is what history does when it cannot confront what actually happened. Now, consider Locusta one final time. She was not a villain in the way that the word is usually used. Not a person whose cruelty was its own reward. Not someone who killed for pleasure or for ideology. She was a professional operating in a market that existed because the Roman system of governance created a consistent, reliable demand for her particular expertise. Remove the demand and Locusta becomes a pharmacologist. Remove the political culture that made murder the most efficient route to succession, and Locusta's knowledge of plants and compounds is medicine, not murder. We look at her and we see a monster. But the system that employed her, the system that gave her estates and students and a golden box to fill with her fastest working preparation, that system is what we built our entire understanding of civilization on. Something to think about. Centuries later, you can walk the Palatine Hill on a warm Roman afternoon and stand in the ruins of the dining rooms where these evenings took place. The marble is mostly gone, taken in the medieval period to build churches and palaces with more immediate practical value. So what remains is brick and volcanic rock, and the careful excavations of archaeologists who have spent generations trying to understand the shape of what stood here. The view from the hill has not changed much. Rome spreads out in every direction. The Forum below, the Colosseum, built by the dynasty that replaced the Julio-Claudians. To the east, the river gleaming silver to the west, the hills beyond the city soft and blue in the afternoon light. Stand there long enough and you can almost hear it. The music, the conversation, the sound of wine being poured, And somewhere beneath that sound, the silence that comes just before history changes. They carried no swords, they led no legions, they won no battles that appear in any military history of any era, but they changed the world, one silent death at a time. One patient evening, one carefully chosen vessel, one door closed at exactly the right moment. They were never on the battlefield. They were the battlefield.